final section, future view. So I ask you to all get your crystal balls out. And Claire, I'll start with you. And you talked about open banking earlier, so I'm going to kind of pull back on pull up that question again. What role can data play in advancing access to trade finance, and what's the opportunity within open banking?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I touched on this earlier. I think it is that democratization of data and allowing access to that data in a smart way, interoperable way, right? And we've seen, we've seen good strides in the consumer space. We're veering into to SMEs. I think to Brian's point is, you've got access to the data, but then you've got to do something intelligent on the top of it, right? So it's applying those tools. So I think the tools are there, the technology is there, the willingness, I think corporate appetite to open up the data. So maybe it's just the last but not insignificant piece is, thinking about kind of the regulatory side of these things, like Brian was mentioning.
Thanks, Claire. And Susan, I guess more of a future kind of looking question. Are you seeing an increasing trend on certain types of kind of trade finance products as we move into, I guess, more of a riskier environment, especially as you mentioned earlier, some of the unfunded trade demands have increased, and that's a question from Azim.
Yes, well, it's an interesting moment in trade finance history. When we look back at this time, what we'll be seeing is really three forces, and it's going to be great to see how this all plays out. One, there's a little, on the one hand, there's more sort of risk skittishness, cross-border banks, cross-border investors, and even those supply chain buyers that are watching carefully on what's going on with the suppliers in their emerging markets remain concerned about the health of these firms and these banks and these economies coming out of this crisis, and while we're still enduring it. And so with that, you see a trend, there is a trend towards sort of a move to back towards some of the documentary side. And we see again this increase in demand for unfunded, which is effectively documentary trade finance. This is a great opportunity for a lot of leaders in these individual emerging market countries to expand as we move out of the crisis, which we all are looking forward to expand those offerings. At the same time, as we've talked about today, there's definitely this acceleration that's a reality in digital technology. So even with our emerging market bank network, 64% of them already at the beginning of 2020 were accelerating their solutions in the digital space. And in 2021, 74% of our emerging market bank members were asking for some form of trade finance digitization support. So we do see these great opportunities of the merging of this digital landscape, the promises that has to offer, the challenges we've discussed. At the same time, we have this moment in time where risk concerns are higher. And so it's going to be interesting to see how fast that dynamic changes. At least for the present, what I would see coming out is a bit of a hybrid there, where we're moving the digital piece to cover what was once documentary and expediting that, but we're still treating that as a bit of a risk factor. It's over the long run or medium run that these benefits are going to convey. And frankly, I think that makes for some very positive outcomes in terms of not just trade finance, but in terms of trade. As trust increases, as the marginal cost of each trade transaction decreases, then that actually is a shape-shifting move for the development evolution of trade itself, which ultimately drives growth in many of these countries. In short, again, our client banks, we've seen the annual outlook that we look at every year for trade and trade finance from our emerging market banking perspective. 50% of our banks had a negative outlook in 2020. And now 73% of the banks that we surveyed have a positive outlook in 2021. So just like the IFC and those of us on the call, they believe in the future of trade and trade finance as well. We're looking for a positive slope change overall in the development trajectory of many of these countries. And my personal view is it's going to be led by trade. That's why I come to work every day.
Thanks, Susan. A very positive view there. Brian, I'm going to end this panel discussion with a, I guess, more of an open question. What's your future-looking view on digital trade, and what do we need to see happening to move forward?
So the impetus is here. I mean, it's driven. COVID has opened the doors really to digitization as a necessity. It's opened the eyes of governments as well. I think we see the G7 now pushing for digitization. So because the prize is huge for everybody, you know, it's financial inclusion for social good, of course, SME financing, absolutely crucial to any economy. So it's absolutely, the impetus is there and it's moving forward. I don't think there will be a two-tier system through digitization. I think there'll be a role for small banks, and increasingly so. And also, and we haven't really touched on this, a role for non-banks. Increasingly, we're seeing that non-banks are, you know, getting involved in financing. We ourselves are launching a platform along with the ICC to involve non-banks in financing called TradeCom. So that is an area that I think will grow in terms of filling the gaps that maybe banks don't or can't fill necessarily at the moment. I think just looking ahead in terms of digitization, if we take it even further, I see and we see that you know, trade as a service, like banking as a service, will become more and more embedded within supply chain. So it'll be more easier for organizations to get access to that level of finance quickly, as and when they're doing business, rather than going off on a parallel stream to seek finance. So that ultimately, I think, is what the customers, our customers and the customers of banks would really like to see. Just have that ability to have that finance as and when they need it, with the minimum of pain to go through the process of getting that finance.
Thank you very much, Brian, and I'd like to thank the panel once again for joining us on this brilliant Tradecast. I think I would like to conclude by just making a few points here, really, and I think, you know, the pandemic has forced us to rethink trade and trade finance, as well as its digitalization in ways we've kind of never really thought about before. But I think what's been really resonant across the whole panel is really thinking about financial inclusion, MSME access to finance for women-owned businesses, and also those smaller businesses in emerging and developing economies. I think as we move forward, we will definitely see an increasing role for smaller banks and non-bank financial institutions. And it seems like the outlook for trade is fairly positive moving forward. And I think technology really is there to help reduce the risk, reduce the cost of finance, but also look at SME risk and credit risk in a completely different perspective. I think we'll definitely see the increase in trade and trade finance as a service. So I'm sure that will be an upcoming theme over the coming years. And we'll also see the evolving of supply chain finance. But I think standardization of data, standardization of trade finance data fields, etc., really is key to moving things forward there. So once again, I'd like to thank Brian Edmondson at Finastra, Susan Starnes at IFC, Natasha Condon at JP Morgan, and Claire Thompson at MasterCard, as well as Finastra, our main sponsors for the Supply Chain 4.0 Optimizing the Chain Tradecast. This Tradecast will be available on demand on tradefinanceglobalcom/Tradecast. And our next Tradecast, which we'll be talking about and providing details shortly, will be in and during COP26 in November with the ICC United Kingdom and the ITFA. Thank you very much for joining. It's been a pleasure.